There was never a moment in John Carter's life when he didn't dream of building something special for his son, Liam, a bright-eyed 10-year-old born with cerebral palsy who had never known the freedom of running across a playground like the other kids in their neatly trimmed suburban neighborhood. From the moment Liam was old enough to express himself, he spoke of adventure, of castles in the sky, of tree houses where he could sit high above the world and feel, just for a moment, like he was soaring, like his legs weren't holding him back, like he was just another boy with dreams too big to be kept on the ground. And so John did what any loving father would do. He built it, plank by plank, nail by nail, working late into the night under the glow of a porch light, determined to give his son the one thing that life had cruelly denied him, a place where he could just be a kid, without limits, without stairs, without the heavy burden of his wheelchair always reminding him of what he couldn't do. The treehouse wasn't just a structure, it was a testament to love, a declaration that no matter how unfair life was, joy could still be carved out of wood and lifted toward the sky, nestled between the branches of an old oak tree that had stood in their backyard long before the HOA ever existed. Neighbors marveled at the craftsmanship, some even stopping by to admire John's handiwork, to smile at the way Liam's eyes lit up when he was finally hoisted up into his wooden sanctuary, sitting cross-legged on soft cushions, pointing excitedly at the world below as if he were a king looking out over his kingdom. It was perfect. It was safe. And most importantly, it was his. But what John didn't realize, what he never even considered in his wildest nightmares, was that the same neighborhood that had watched him pour his soul into that treehouse, the same people who had once applauded his dedication as a father, were about to turn against him in a way that would shake the very foundation of everything he had ever believed about fairness, about decency, about what it meant to live in a place where rules were meant to protect people, not punish them. It started with a letter typed in a cold, lifeless font, slipped into their mailbox without so much as a knock on the door, without a moment of human decency to prepare them for what was coming. It was from the Homeowners Association, an entity John had never paid much attention to, a faceless, soulless organization that claimed to exist for the betterment of the community, but had never once lifted a finger to help his son navigate the cracked sidewalks or the playgrounds with no wheelchair ramps. The letter was brief, almost dismissive, as if the person who wrote it had spent more time debating their choice of font than considering the family they were about to devastate. The treehouse must come down immediately. It was an unauthorized structure, a violation of Subdivision Regulation 14B, and if John did not comply within 7 days, he would be fined. John read the words again, his hands shaking, his mind unable to comprehend how something built from love, something that had given his son the first taste of true independence, could be considered a violation of anything other than the cruel, mechanical rules of people who had never known what it meant to fight for something real. He looked over at Liam, who was laughing inside his treehouse, unaware of the war that had just been declared against his happiness. For the first time since he had started building it, John felt the sharp sting of regret, not because he had done something wrong, but because he had foolishly believed that the world would ever let something so pure exist without trying to tear it down. John had never been a confrontational man, never the type to make enemies or stir up trouble where it wasn't necessary, but as he stood in his driveway, gripping the letter from the HOA with white-knuckled fists, he felt something inside him shift. Something raw, something primal, the kind of anger that only comes when a person realizes that the world isn't just indifferent to their suffering, but actively working against them. At first, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a calm conversation, with reason, with decency. But when he called the number listed on the letter, he was met with the voice of a stone-hearted bureaucrat, a woman who introduced herself as Sandra Whitmore, president of the Evergreen Homeowners Association, a name that had long been whispered in the neighborhood with a mixture of fear and frustration, a woman known not for improving the community, but for ruling it like a dictator in a pantsuit. "Yes, Mr. Carter, I'm well aware of your situation," she said in a voice that carried the same warmth as an eviction notice. "And I understand that you believe this treehouse is sentimental. But the rules are the rules. You should have applied for a variance before constructing an unauthorized structure on HOA property. HOA property? John echoed, his voice sharp. That tree is on my land. That treehouse is for my son. I understand, but regulations are in place for a reason. If we allow one exception, we'll have to allow them all. We can't have people building whatever they want. Imagine if someone wanted to put up an unsightly shed, or a chicken coop, or a massive jungle gym. John let out a humorless laugh, disgust curling in his gut. A jumble gym? That's what you're comparing this to? This isn't a storage shed or some tacky lawn decoration. This is something my son needs. He can't play in your perfect little neighborhood parks, Sandra. They aren't built for kids like him. But this treehouse gives him freedom. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a brief moment, John thought he might have gotten through to her. That maybe, just maybe, she was human after all. But then she cleared her throat, and her voice returned to its default setting of unfeeling indifference. I'm afraid the decision is final, Mr. Carter, she said. The structure must come down, or you will be fined $250 per day until it is removed. If the fines exceed $50,000, the HOA will take legal action to collect the debt, including placing a lien on your home. A lien? John felt his knees go weak as the weight of those words crashed down on him like a wave. They weren't just threatening to take the treehouse, they were threatening to take everything. Their home. Liam's home. The place where they had built a life, where they had shared bedtime stories, celebrated birthdays, cried over hospital stays, and clung to each other through every challenge that came their way. The idea that they could lose it all over something so petty, so cruel, so unnecessary made John's stomach churn with white-hot rage. Do you even have a heart, Sandra? He asked, his voice shaking. Do you understand what you're doing to my son? Or are you just so obsessed with your stupid rules that you'd rather ruin a child's happiness than admit you're wrong? Sandra sighed as if she were bored, as if this was just another routine complaint from an unruly homeowner who didn't know his place. This isn't personal, Mr. Carter. If you fail to comply, you will face the consequences. The HO always wins. And then she hung up. For a long time, John just stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the cold finality of those words ringing in his head like a judge's gavel. The HO always wins. The HO always wins. The HO always wins. Not this time. John had spent his entire life trying to be the kind of man who followed the rules, who kept his head down, who didn't cause trouble. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about Liam. And if the HOA thought they could scare him into submission, if they thought he would let them tear down his son's dream without a fight, they were about to learn something very, very important about the kind of man they were dealing with. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to burn their entire system to the ground. John had never been the kind of man to pick fights, never the type to stand on a soapbox and rally against authority. But something inside him had snapped the moment Sandra Whitmore uttered those smug, soulless words. The HO always wins. It wasn't just about the treehouse anymore. It wasn't just about a $50,000 fine or some obscure regulation buried in a handbook no one had ever read. It was about something bigger, something deeper, a battle between power and principle, between a rigid system designed to control people and a father who refused to let his son's joy be erased like an inconvenience. If the HOA wanted a fight, they had just picked one with the wrong man. But John knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed the neighborhood to see the truth, not the polished, controlled version of events the HOA would spin, but the real story, the one where an innocent child's happiness was being ripped away by a group of heartless bureaucrats hiding behind bylaws and board meetings. So he did the one thing the HOA had never expected. He took his fight public. The first thing he did was reach out to his neighbors, the ones who had watched him build the treehouse, the ones who had smiled when they saw Liam's face light up from his perch among the branches, the ones who whispered complaints about Sandra Whitmore but never dared to speak them out loud. John knocked on doors, stood on porches, told his story over steaming cups of coffee and hesitant glances. And to his surprise, people listened. More than that, they agreed. "This isn't right," said Mrs. Donovan, the elderly widow who had lived in Evergreen Estate since it was built. "I've seen what that treehouse means to your boy. I don't care what some rulebook says, this is cruel." "I had a run-in with them last year over my backyard fence," muttered Mr. Alvarez, a retired Navy veteran who still carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had seen battle. "They fined me $5,000 because the color wasn't on their approved palette. They do whatever they want, John. Someone needs to stand up to them. Someone." John realized in that moment that he was that someone. But neighborhood support wasn't enough, not against an HOA that had lawyers, money, and an iron grip on their contracts. So John did the next best thing. He went to war in the only battlefield that could turn the tide in his favor: social media. He took a picture of Liam sitting in his treehouse, his smile radiant, his eyes filled with a joy that no rulebook should have the power to take away. And then he wrote, "This is my son Liam. He was born with cerebral palsy. He will never run, never climb, never know the simple freedom that most children take for granted. But he has this treehouse, a place where, for the first time in his life, he feels like he can fly. The HOA wants to tear it down. They want to fine us $50,000 for the crime of giving my son a taste of happiness. I won't let them. If you believe in kindness, in fairness, in the right of every child to experience joy, please share this. Let the world know what's happening here." And the world did. Within hours, the post had thousands of shares. By the next morning, it was on the front page of Reddit. By the afternoon, local news stations were calling his phone, asking for interviews. Then came the reporters. Then the outrage. People started digging into the HOA, uncovering years of complaints, fines, lawsuits. Families who had been forced to sell their homes over absurd penalties. Disabled veterans, elderly homeowners, single mothers, people who had been chewed up and spit out by an organization that had no soul, only greed. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about the treehouse anymore. It was about abuse of power. It was about a system that had been allowed to run unchecked for too long. And the HOA? They were losing control of the narrative. Sandra Whitmore, for all her arrogance, had not been prepared for the sheer force of public opinion. She hadn't expected the angry emails, the letters, the calls from local government officials suddenly sniffing around Evergreen Estates, asking questions they had never asked before. She hadn't expected the boycott of local businesses owned by HOA board members, homeowners who had once lived in fear now refusing to pay their dues in silent protest. And then the breaking point. A local disability rights group caught wind of the story. They had lawyers. They had resources. They had one mission: to make an example out of anyone who stood in the way of accessibility for children like Liam. They sent a legal team to John's doorstep. "Mr. Carter," the lead attorney said, shaking his hand firmly, "we'd like to help you fight this. And more importantly, we'd like to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. The HOA was backed into a corner. And John? John wasn't just fighting for his son anymore. He was fighting for every family that had ever been bullied, threatened, or silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect them. And what the HOA didn't realize, what they couldn't understand, was that they had just started a war they could never win. Because when you fight against a father's love for his child, you are always destined to lose. Sandra Whitmore had always believed herself to be untouchable. For years, she had ruled Evergreen Estates with an iron fist, enforcing bylaws with ruthless precision, wielding fines and legal threats like weapons against anyone who dared to challenge her authority. She had seen uprisings before, homeowners who grumbled, who complained, who thought they could resist. But in the end, the HOA always won. This time, though, something was different. This time, the story had escaped her control. This time, her phone wouldn't stop ringing, not just with angry homeowners, but with reporters, with government officials demanding answers, with lawyers who had started digging into HOA finances, questioning why so many of the association's fines seemed to funnel into mysterious accounts with no clear oversight. It was a nightmare. And worst of all, it was personal now. Because buried deep beneath Sandra's layers of rules and regulations, beneath the cold exterior of a woman who had spent decades enforcing power without question, was a pain she had never spoken aloud. Not to her board. Not to her neighbors. Not to anyone. Not since 1968. Not since she was 12 years old, standing in her childhood backyard, watching through tears as her father cut down the treehouse her older brother had built for her, by hand, with love, with the same hopeful determination that John Carter had shown. Not since her father, strict, authoritarian, obsessed with rules and order, had told her brother, "This is not a playground. This is not your property. We do not allow things that do not belong here." And she had watched powerless as the structure that had made her feel free, the only place where she had ever been allowed to dream, was reduced to splinters. Rules were rules. That's what her father had said. And now, half a century later, that's what she had become. A woman who tore things down. A woman who destroyed joy rather than protected it. Sandra sat in her office, staring at the legal documents piling up in front of her, listening to the voice of a reporter on the news outside her window. A reporter talking about her, about how she had become the face of corporate cruelty, the symbol of everything wrong with HOAs, the villain of a story that had captured the entire country's attention. She had spent her entire life believing she was right. But now she wasn't so sure. The final blow came 3 days later, when John Carter received an anonymous envelope in the mail. No return address. No signature. Just a single sheet of paper inside. Document. A HOA board resolution from 1992. One that Sandra had personally signed. One that stated in clear, legally binding terms that any structure built for medical necessity or therapeutic benefit could be granted an exemption to HOA architectural rules. A loophole. A loophole that meant the treehouse had always been legal. A loophole that meant the $50,000 fine was unlawful. A loophole that meant everything the HOA had done to the Carter family was not just cruel, but illegal. John took the document straight to his lawyer. His lawyer took it straight to court. And when the case went before a judge, when the truth was exposed, when the paper trail was laid out for the world to see, when the HOA's history of fraudulent fines, shady dealings, and power-hungry decisions were dragged into the light for the first time in decades, it was over. The HOA lost. The fines erased. The legal threats dropped. The treehouse protected. And Sandra Whitmore, the woman who had spent her life hiding behind rules, using them as a shield to justify every act of cruelty, every piece of joy she had ever crushed beneath the weight of her own trauma, she resigned. Not because she had to. Not because she had been forced. But because, for the first time in 50 years, she had looked in the mirror and seen the person she had become. And she didn't like what she saw. The story didn't end there. The lawsuit that followed led to one of the largest HOA reform movements in the country, with new laws passed that stripped HOAs of unchecked power, forcing them to answer to actual homeowners, not power-hungry boards. The treehouse? It became a symbol, not just for Liam, not just for John, but for every family who had ever been bullied by people who valued rules over compassion. And Sandra, she disappeared from the public eye for a while. But one afternoon, months after the fight had ended, John received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, just a single sentence on a plain piece of paper. I'm sorry. He would have loved that treehouse too. John didn't need to ask who sent it. He just folded the letter, slipped it into a drawer, and stepped outside to find Liam in the treehouse, laughing free, exactly where he was always meant to be. Because sometimes rules need to be broken. Sometimes battles need to be fought. And sometimes the only way to fix what's broken is to finally see it for what it really is.